Me and my band are playing a small, intimate gig this December in Newcastle, supported by the brilliant Elation. The link for tickets is in the description, and it would be great to see you there. Simon Garfunkel released Bridge Over Troubled Water in 1970, a song that is performed almost entirely on piano and vocal. It went on to be one of their most popular songs and the title of their most popular album. That song has captured listeners for over 50 years. But what is it about that composition that is so magical? It was actually written by Paul Simon, and the lyrics are, of course, brilliant and very moving. But we're not looking at the lyrics today. Today our focus is on the music. And when I kind of broke down this song to analyse it, I noticed something really interesting about the way it's been constructed. The vocal melody, the part sung by Art Garfunkel, is actually pretty straightforward. The simplest possible collection of notes you can use for a melody is the 7 notes of the major scale. And interestingly, the vocal line for this song only uses those notes all the way through, with the exception of just one single word, which occurs in the verses. Beautiful though it is, the melody itself is not that complicated. This is not Asia by Steely Dan by any stretch of the imagination. The chords, however, are much more complex and involved, and that's where I think most of the magic comes from in this song. That interesting mix of a fairly straightforward and very accessible major scale melody combined with a truly brilliant, unusual and creative chord sequence. So today I want to look at the techniques involved in crafting a chord sequence like Paul Simon did. I'm going to look at 5 specific techniques used in Bridge Over Troubled Water and try and explain them as simply as I possibly can, so that if you want to, you can use them in your songs as well. So let's start with technique number 1, making every line different. The vast majority of songs on the radio and in the charts today don't do this. Broadly speaking, a verse is just the same set of 3 or 4 chords repeated 4 times. In fact, when it comes to the simpler pop music that now dominates the music scene, that's always been the case. On screen now, you can see the verse chord sequence for Brown Eyed Girl by Van Morrison. The verse is just the same line repeated 4 times. Here's the verse chord sequence to Mr. Brightside by The Killers. A similar arrangement, just 4 identical lines. And here's Bad Moon Rising, exactly the same thing again. 4 lines, all identical. And now, take a look at the chord sequence for the verse of Bridge Over Troubled Water. Paul Simon didn't just write one catchy line and then repeat it 4 times for this song. He made every line completely unique, with the melody and the chords changing every single time. You can even see that the last line has an uneven number of bars, just 3 bars instead of the usual 4. Whilst there's nothing wrong with a bit of simplicity in songwriting now and again, this is not an exercise in mind-numbing repetition. This is a song that gives you something new and interesting on every single line. Now, the original song is in every guitarist's favourite key, E flat. So, for the purposes of this video, to make it a little more accessible for beginner guitarists and people who are just starting out as songwriters on the guitar, I'm going to be explaining it in the key of D. But if you want to play along with the record using the shapes that I show you, all you have to do is put a capo on fret 1. On screen now is the chord sequence as I've transcribed it for the intro, the first verse and the first chorus, and it can look very intimidating and a bit overwhelming. There's just so many chords. Now in the key of D, there are actually 7 basic chords, 7 normal chords. These are D, E minor, F sharp minor, G, A, B minor and C sharp diminished. So, if this song had been written by someone just starting out in songwriting, a beginner, they would probably have written it using mainly those chords. So what we're going to do now, just to illustrate this, is we're going to kind of pare back the chord sequence. We're going to simplify it. We're going to take out any chords that I reckon we could perhaps do without. I'm going to take this chord sequence and simplify it into the kind of tune I might give to, say, a 9-year-old beginner. Just the really important central chords, keeping the whole thing much, much simpler than the original. Now that is still the same song, isn't it? But with those other chords removed, with those link chords, those transition chords, those embellishments, it really has lost something. So what we're going to do for the remaining 4 techniques is we're going to add the chords we've removed back in, step by step, explaining what we're doing and why as we go. So now let's move straight on to technique number 2, keeping the bass note the same while changing the chord over the top. We're going to apply this to the second chord in the verse, that G chord. We're going to keep that bass note as a D, so now it will be written like this. When you see G/D or any kind of slash chord, the first letter is the chord and the second letter is the different bass note. And by keeping the bass note the same for the first 3 bars here, we create a sense of continuity and a kind of drone underneath the chords. So let's have a quick listen to that first line with that one chord changed. That little change really adds something, doesn't it? A little touch of class. The sequence feels less clunky, less basic, and it flows better. In your chord sequences, experiment around with doing the same thing, keeping the bass note consistent while the chords change over the top. A really easy way to experiment with this is use an open string as your note that stays the same. A very easy way to just get started with this is taking a chord like an E and then moving the chord shape up 2 frets. You can also move it up 3 frets, 5 frets, 7 frets, 8 frets. Just play around with it and see what different sounds you can get. But in Bridge Over Troubled Water, Paul Simon didn't just keep the bass note the same and move the chord, he also did the reverse. And that's technique number 3, keeping the chord the same while changing the bass note underneath. And we're going to apply this technique to a little run of chords in the last 2 lines of the verse. We're going to have a look at the last bar of the 3rd line. Currently it's just a D, so let's change the bar halfway through. Let's move the bass line down 1 degree of the scale, down 1 fret to a C sharp. Now let's do the same thing again on the next bar, but this time we're actually going to go to a note that's not even in the scale, a C. And then we're going to come in from the bottom of the guitar using an E and an F sharp to lead into the next chord, which is a G. Let's have a listen. Again, massive improvement. That walking bass line underneath a stationary chord is really emotive and it works in the context of the song. In your songwriting, you can play around with this as well. Just listen to all the different sounds you can get over a G chord by just changing the bass note. Thus far, we've looked at various techniques to make the basic 7 chords a little more interesting, a little more complex, and maybe a bit less boring. But there's still much more we can do. Let's look at technique number 4, 7th chords. Whilst in reality there are loads of variations, there are typically 3 main kinds of 7th chord that get used in rock and pop songs. These are just plain 7 chords, also called dominant sevenths, major 7th chords, and minor 7th chords. Paul Simon used 7th chords in Bridge Over Troubled Water in various different ways, and a frequent technique of his was to use them as kind of link chords, so they would kind of prepare the ear for the next chord that was coming. So in a bar of 4 beats he would play a 7th chord on beat 4 before moving into the next bar. And as you can see, we're going to add that in on the first line, a D7 chord as beat 4 of the 3rd bar. And now let's have a listen to that. That sounds great, but we're not finished yet. 2 bars later, we've got another plain bar of D with nothing interesting going on. So what can we do to add a bit of interest? Let's put in a different 7th link chord this time on a different beat of the bar. Let's use a D major 7 and let's bring it in on beat 3, halfway through. And this is all about creating just a little bit of interest, variation and irregularity in the chord pattern. That little D major 7 change is so gorgeous. I absolutely love that. But we don't have to only use these 7th chords as link chords. You can actually change some of the main chords in the main body of the chord sequence into 7th chords to improve the sound. Look here at these 2 bars of A. There's not much going on there, so let's turn those both into A7s. So now let's go on to the 5th and final technique, inserting non-diatonic chords, which means chords from other keys. So far we haven't strayed very far from the basic 7 chords. Most of what we've done is embellished and changed them in various ways. But now we're going to bring in chords from other keys, which will create a whole host of new sounds, colours and flavours in the chord sequence. First up, let's add a chord to follow that one movement in the verse where the vocal melody sings a note outside of the basic 7. That's here in bar 4. The vocal line there sings the note from outside the scale is a C, so let's put a brief C chord there and see if it works. It absolutely does. In the verse there is one more change to make, and that is turning this chord, the E minor, into an E major, another chord that doesn't belong in this key, but does sound very pleasing to the ear nonetheless. And let's make it an E7, so we're using a bit of technique number 4 as well. Now it may look like there are still some bars left in this verse we could still improve, some bars that are just still a plain boring old basic chord, but there is still one thing left to add in. If you listen to the original, each of these empty bars is actually filled with a series of further link chords connecting one bar to the next. For example, in this bar we have an A with a C sharp in the bass and a G with a B on the bass on beats 3 and 4, leading into that A7 there. And then again, coming out of the A7, we have those same chords in reverse, but this time the timing is varied, with both chords falling within the 4th beat. And finally, there is also a D and an A in this 3rd bar of the final line. This echoes the G-C-G we saw in the 4th bar, and it's leading us in to the chorus. And so just look at the construction of the chord sequence for the verse of this song. It's incredibly interesting, incredibly complex, with almost zero repetition. And so there you have it. We started out with a very simple version of the chord sequence, and piece by piece incorporated techniques from Paul Simon's bag of songwriting tricks to transform it into the version that was released on record. And hopefully breaking those techniques down in that way can be helpful to you in writing your songs. Most people today, when writing songs, don't do any of these things. They typically just get that standard 4-chord structure, repeat it 4 times, and say job done. However, for many of the great songwriting masters, particularly of the 60s and 70s, that would still have been an unfinished song. If you have a song on your books that you know has the potential to be something moving and powerful, but you know you haven't quite got it right yet, why not try applying some of these techniques to it and just see what happens? And so, just to finish off today, I thought I would literally demonstrate that. I thought I would take a song that everyone knows pretty much and apply these techniques to it so you can hear the difference it can make. This is the chord sequence to Everybody Hurts by R.E.M., a song which is actually very well suited to demonstrating this. We're going to have a crack at that song now. We're going to lift some of the embellishments and flourishes from Bridge Over Troubled Water, just for demonstration's sake, so you can hear how it changes the feel and vibe of the music. And in this final demonstration, I'm also going to actually take some chords from the chorus of Bridge Over Troubled Water and apply them to the chorus of Everybody Hurts. You see there how you can almost visualise a song and a chord sequence as actually 2 layers. In a song like Everybody Hurts, we've got that fairly basic chord sequence which you can use to play the whole song from start to finish. That's effectively the skeleton. But then you can overlay it with another layer of chords on top, the link chords and the embellishments that don't fundamentally change the song too much, but just add that little touch of class, that sense of purpose and intention to those changes. And that's the flesh and blood. That's the finished article. Many songs today never get beyond the skeleton. And of course, just to clarify, I in no way think that I can actually improve on Everybody Hurts by R.E.M. It was just a very useful guinea pig in my experiment because it sits so nicely next to Bridge Over Troubled Water. That's all. Anyway, I hope that's been interesting. I hope that fires off some ideas in any of you budding songwriters out there. Have fun playing around with that, and as always, I'll see you next time.